Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hope your week was well. Enough. Good enough. Might take the time to be with the other yogis on the other pages. I think sometimes beginning the sitting by just kind of quietly receiving the power of the goodness of our Sangha together, just to shift into the receptive attention by receiving goodness and kind-heartedness. Taking refuge in Sangha. Taking refuge in the intention to really be interested in how things are. And sometimes this shift into the non-conceptual can happen, I think, more easily through noticing if our attention can be at times receptive. The emphasis being right now with any kind of hearing, the silence, any sounds. That we see that, of course, the conceptual arises, so the thoughts about sounds will appear in the present moment. And we just notice that as thinking, no problem. So we don't make a problem out of thinking through shifting to non-conceptual, but we give the non-conceptual more airtime by gently returning to receiving the textures, vibrations of the sounds directly, not through the thought process. So it's that gentle return to receiving directly as things are, as they're happening. And it is just like jumping into a fast moving stream. So we'll come up, bob up into a thought about the experience and jump back in. And often we'll start to taste that ease of well-being, or that tendency to want to do something with what's appearing, to get rid of, fix, manipulate. Figure out, want more of. You start to prefer the mystery and the unknown, the exploration of every new moment revealing itself. And being within that. And as we see, we don't have to make it happen. It just is always there happening. We can shift into our hands. Never again, this moment. Getting that taste for the unknown. The quiet, unknown wilderness of things just as they are. So simple, but so tempting to want to fiddle with what is. And with the movement of the breath, again, there's that initial quenching of the need for air. For that movement of life. And dropping into receiving the unknown emerge moment by moment. And at times just checking in to see if the awareness starts to get judgmental or comparing with however it's unfolding. And just seeing if you can bring some, it can be very light, like a light tenderness, kindness, for not being able to control how things are unfolding. But we can shift to caring about how we're relating to how things are unfolding. Just as they are. So, of course, at times we jump into this moment to moment sixth sense door flow of awareness, receiving that emergence of life and death moment by moment. And other times we might just stay with hearing hands or breath, hands or breath. Or some kind heartedness or tenderness. Just quiet being with things just as they are without embellishment.
Thank you, Michelle. I recently saw a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that I've always liked, but just felt like it kind of struck me in a new way recently. He said somewhere, "Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war." Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. So powerful, and such a evocative and complex series of uh, questions, investigations, explorations that I feel like come out of the tension in that. What is effective organizing for peace? At what scale? In what context? How many wars have started because of disagreements around those perspectives, those views? What is the nature of an organization, a system that seeks peace as its outcome at whatever scale? I recently joined an organization that believes it has a a handle on that. And in their recent newsletter, they had a great quote from AJ Musty I wanted to share, and adding to the complexity of the exploration. A union or a democratic organization. This is what the director is explaining what Musty. So AJ Musty, for folks who don't know, is this like incredible pacifist pastor, labor organizer, um, mm, mm, Dutch originally, and through his life, just kind of wove back and forth and into this world of being a pastor, being a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church, and then leaving in World War One and becoming a Congregationalist, and then leaving that and going to the Quakers, and kind of that all interspersed with just incredible dedication to labor movement, to pacifism, nonviolence. Um, really amazing life, and someone who wrestled with a lot of complicated ideas around this. And so she's paraphrasing his words, and then it's a quote of his: "A union or a democratic organization must be like an army," he said, "with soldiers in the class war ready to act swiftly in unison and with discipline. to win concrete victories and defend itself against the owning class. He was a real socialist. Uh, but it also must be like a debate society, replacing an education system in democratic town square, largely co-opted by elites in order to promote that exploration of new ideas and strategies by its membership. These functions require very different structures, and yet we have just one organization. The tensions are inherent, in his words. The situation is truly serious. The impossible is demanded of the union and its leadership. Yet there is no solution to the dilemma. As in which, as in so many other situations which life confronts human beings, there is no cut and dried answer to be found, which once and for all settles the case. The solution consists in making from time to time adjustments which synthesize two quite incompatible functions. Nothing is further from a solution than the simple device of cutting out or ignoring one or the other of the terms. The union must remain both an army and a town meeting. It must at the same time both fight and discuss. The question of scale is sometimes literal, sometimes metaphoric, right? So even just on the metaphoric level, this notion of uh, a structure of an organization, a form, a system that is oriented towards a kind of liberation, right? If we talk about our meditation practice, and of course, in other places, this metaphor is something that, I've talked about and written about more. Um, but this tension, just that in that terms, in terms of discipline and conversation, right? Of unity and exploration, of action and reflection. This tension is so powerful in our world and so fundamental, even in our own meditation practice. And it shows up in many ways, but one of the ways in which it shows up significantly and in ways that don't end up just being metaphorical is around the relationship between concentration and mindfulness, right? That there is very much this way that we are navigating this internal dynamic in a very same way in our meditation practice, oriented towards peace, oriented towards the ending of the internal strife, the internal war that feels like a war at times. And we understand that there are there's principles, there's structure and um, spirit, right, involved in how we go about this. And so we understand that there are times around and the impulse towards structure, towards coherence, towards unity, towards concentration, right? The bringing of the attention towards one object and observing it, and the power that can result from that, right? The clarity, the strength, the determination of mind that can come through concentration is um, beyond fathomability, really, the Buddha said. When we talk about deep absorptive concentration. So the power of concentration is so great and so compelling. And yet to be fascinated by power, to be fascinated by unity, to be fascinated with this sense of concentration and the coherence of that unity at it at the expense of that openness and honesty and relationship to the complexity and internal disagreement, internal wildness, internal um, complexity doesn't serve us, right? That the unity, the unification of mind, right? The concentration only serves as a liberating force to the degree that it is used to explore, right? To bring the conversation that's internal, the dynamics that are internal to light, the truth, the reality of things, in which the concentration can sometimes override, right? It can kind of sublimate the wildness and the discomfort of all of the tension in ourselves, in our minds, our hearts, our bodies, for the sake of wanting this unified mind of samadhi, right? That sense of oneness, that we can feel so nourished by at times, but that we have to be careful that we aren't looking for that at the expense of the truth and a relationship, a liberatory, unbinding, caring, tender, sensitive, just relationship with the truth of the reality we experience internally. And so, of course, what we see internally and that we also see in bigger structures in the world in times of crisis, there is a more of a impulse, a contraction towards unity, towards uh, that desire for power, um, action that is coherent, that is unified, that can meet a challenge, externally or internally. Nothing wrong with that, of course, right? There's something skillful, there's something natural in that impulse. But also, where is it that we need to be suspicious too, in a healthy way? Suspect of our own motivations, right? Is our feeling of powerlessness, our inability to feel the ache of powerlessness, our inability to feel the ache of pain, of hardship, of suffering in our own lives or in the lives of others? Is it our inability to be with that honestly, beautifully, peacefully caring? Is it so hard for us to be with it that the compulsion to act, the compulsion to unify, to clarity, to disregard complexity is what we lean towards? How often do we have to see in ourselves, in our world, the dangers of that ignoring, the betrayal of ourselves, of our principles, of those we care about in the world through these contractions, of the heart and of our world? Where is maybe it's unresolvable, like Musty says, probably, probably it is. And so this sense of synthesizing and dynamism and this willingness to move back and forth between the complexity and the impulses of unity and diversity, of power and wisdom. Where do those things strengthen one another? Where do they threaten one another? You know, how important it is to explore these things in all aspects of our lives, our practice, our world. On Friday, I went to participate in one of the local little standout sign wavings, for the ceasefire in Gaza. And there's something very intimate when you're in a small town. You're not in a big city. There's not crowds. There's maybe 10 people, and um, for anyone who's ever participated in anything like that, there's just these dynamics, that are so often at play. the sense of unity around something, the sense of coherence, and something that feels maybe a moral certitude. And then there's all kinds of complexity and all kinds of difference, and um, the bubbling up of schisms and disagreements. And mm, one of the beautiful things about this time was one of my friends brought two of his children, and they're little, I think maybe 4 and 8 or something like that. And I was one of these children. I was, I spent a lot of my childhood at meetings and protests and things like that. I never considered that I might have played a role that was important in just my not being involved in the theme, of what was happening. But this idea of just like having children there who are, one who was reading just her book on the wall, and the little one who was, drawing with chalk on the pavement. This like so refreshing of like where this sense of like coherence and unity and ideological um, solidity can be so compelling to have a kid drawing, on the pavement in chalk. And he was just learning how to spell, so he spelled his name out, and my friend was like, "Oh, do you want to?" He had a sign. And he's like, "Do you want to spell, ceasefire?" And the kid was like, "No," you know. And he drew this like long line, and then he started crossing, all these just making kind of cross lines on it. And I was like, oh, I wonder what that is. It looked kind of like a snake skeleton or an antenna or something, And says, "Oh, what is that?" I said, "It's a cupcake holder." Mm. I was like, "Oh God, thank God you're here." I'm just like, yes, like let's just keep doing that, And he did, and not on my command. It's like there was cupcake holders, drawn along the sidewalk. How important that felt in like such an incredible way. How dangerous it felt, right? Because there is this other side of like, here we are on a street and the world is crazy and there's people driving by, and we know that there are people who will just enact violence on whomever that they disagree with, and what does it mean to have these like beautiful, vulnerable children, in the midst of something that's um, something also very serious, And it's like, again, in our practice, there's how many times do we hear it's like, oh, my mind is, I'm wandering here, I'm falling asleep, the mind is thinking about stuff, it's not behaving the way we want it to be. We want to be focused and concentrated and, at this work of liberation. And this is what it's about like this method and building power and doing it. And it's like, it's why we are so clear in the practice of like, no, like the little kid drawing cupcake holder in your mind is an important part of this, right? It's not just about following your breath, and it's not just about the method of like building concentration and building insight in these ways. It's like what is the relationship to this whole spectrum of being, right? The naive parts of ourselves, the greedy parts of ourselves, the hateful parts of ourselves. Are we doing work to build this relationship, right? That this is not just about discipline. This is not just a work about internal discipline. The Vipassana practice as a path to peace, as a structure that leads to peace, is not one that is just about discipline. There are elements of concentration. There's elements of management control, creating a container that feels safe enough for these vulnerable parts of ourselves to be able to play, to be able to feel like they have room to breathe, that they're not so oppressed by this determination of ours to get free. What is the internal structure of our practice that allows for that vulnerability to be there, right? That sensitivity, the playfulness, the sleepiness, all of these things that we might feel like are distractions from the goal. How do we actually start to see that we're using this as a protective space to understand these parts of ourselves? You know, you have been uh, mentored by some people from the same era, of Musty and, later of King. It's like who were just committed pacifists, and you read about them and their lives and people like them. There's a way in which it's like, I am sure that their lives were more complex than this. But what ends up getting in their lives and their practice and their paths were more complex than this. But so often, what ends up getting communicated, either by them or their organizations or those who pen the history, is pacifism as a essentially just a moral discipline. And I think to some degree that was and is still somehow a way that we hold it, right? That it's like to be around people for whom it's just like that's just it. Killing is wrong, violence is wrong, and there is like no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to participate in it. And we're going to be willing to suffer all of the physical, social consequences of that stance. I mean, there's something so amazing about that, right? And there's something so profound and inspiring about that in history and our ability to look at Dorothy Day and to look at all these people and just be like, it's incredible, right? How this determination. And whether it's our time in history or something, there we are at a time where there is more understanding, more acceptance that that is not enough for most people, right? That we're still going to have these extraordinary people who will just like let everything burn to the ground in terms of their lives and uh, bodies, and in order to make a stance for peace. But that for many people, that isn't enough. And as a society, perhaps it shouldn't be the only way in which we are expected to explore these things, right? I have a friend who, had said this, like, he was the victim of violence as a child, incredible violence. And he made this determination in his life that when he had a family and had children, he was not going to subject them to that. And that he said, it's like, I can say, I've never raised a hand against my children. I've never physically harmed them. And to take stock of how just phenomenal a, an accomplishment that is in one human life. But he also said, but I also know that they're afraid of me, that it's not just the fear of violence, that there's still something in me around anger that is not resolved. And that I have passed. There's something in there that I have not been able to just tame and control and subjugate to my discipline. That something has still leaked in that way. And that is part of his spiritual journey now, is trying to understand that, trying to come to terms with that, trying to come to heal these other parts, right, of the heart that need healing in order to not convey violence in these other ways. Right. And so that we're aware that like we also need tools, we need space, we need protected spaces to practice these extremely complicated things, these extremely complicated commas in our lives, right? That we have inherited in our families, in our communities, in our cultures, in our world. We are managing so much. And to have a space, community of structures that are allow for that exploration and that protective space where we can be vulnerable, that where we can be honest about our unresolved violence, our unresolved greed, unresolved delusion, right? Not just with shame, but with interest and willingness to explore it, and not just destroy it or manipulate or control it, but to understand it as this mechanism of liberation that we have so much faith in sometimes. I've started reading this book called Metazoa, and it has to do with like the like evolutionary biology of consciousness. I think how there are like science books that are written for like not science people, and they're um and so sometimes I find them like they're like a little too kind of dopey, they're just like too funny and they're too like kind of goofy. This one's not. This one's like a little bit too smart for me to like totally grasp what's going on. I'll like read things and I'll be like, I just honestly don't understand what that is, but I'm gonna keep going. Um, because there are really fascinating things about it. And so well, I'm still in the beginning, and he's talking about the like moving from single cell organisms to multi-cell organisms and like that shift. And this question of subjectivity and agency. Subjectivity, the matter of seeming for meanness or um, to meanness, right? It points towards experience as something that happens to a person, right? We are subject to these six sense fields. Agency is a matter of doing, of trying, of initiating. Agency is by meanness. It is being as a source of action and its effects. As everyday concepts, subjectivity and agency gesture towards different aspects of a person or animal, a more sensory side and a more active side. From an evolutionary point of view, however, these are closely tied together. Sensing has its raison d'être in the control of action. Nothing is gained biologically from taking in information that is not put to use. The evolution of the mind includes the coupled evolution of agency and subjectivity, but not everything has developed in lockstep. He's influenced by this guy, Fred Kaiser, also Dutch, who has an interesting suggestion. He thinks that some new kinds of sensing may come for free or almost for free as a consequence of shaping of complex action. So, like, you're a organism that needs some new tool, and through random mutation, you develop this like tentacle, right? That can get you to do this thing, and that you are now have a different sense of agency, right? You have a capacity to do something. Well, that tentacle also is more than likely going to also have its sensitive quality to it. And so it isn't that things are necessarily evolving at the same rate or in the same way or at the same time, but that they kind of bounce back and forth. That's so with a new branch of agency, we are often more sensitive, right? That tentacle is sensitive to the world around us. And it's sensitive in ways that perhaps that tentacle is going to be able to respond to, you know. Um, or that nuclear bomb, right? So it's like even if a nervous system were looking entirely inward, which he isn't suggesting that they ever are, the system will still be responsive to things on the outside. Such a system can't help seeing outward to some extent. New and expansive actions carry an expansion of sensitivity along with them. And so this thing of like going from a single cell to multicellular to like animals, the evolution of animals produced multicellular action. Action achieved through sheets of cells that contract, twist, and grasp. Nerves and muscles made this possible. A sponge can do nothing like it. Action of this kind was a transformative invention in evolution. It changed everything. We think about like how complex, how hard it is for people to have figured this out in terms of like evolutionary biology. And it's not, I'm not saying maybe it's not true, but that this is the suspicion, and there's evidence that points to this sort of dynamism around like agency and subjectivity, of action and sensitivity that is very profound and very sensitive and very mysterious, you know, and that co-evolves. And then we think about how complex that is as a coherent organism, right? That has all of these systems at play, all of these sensitivities, looking to, and then where is this sort of sense of like this mechanism of response to what the stimulation is? How does that propel a sense of me-ness and mine-ness and agency? And how does that determine the interpretation of what is coming inwardly, right? That so much of what Vipassana practice is exploring is some aspect of this, not on maybe the cellular level, but on a level of consciousness that's very subtle, you know, that's like very profound of like, how is this happening? And what kind of stimulus externally leads to what kind of result internally, what kind of determination around action externally? And that in our system, in our method, there is a value in this space and understanding that by observation, things things that may have seemed inevitable, that seem unavoidable in terms of sensitivity and response, sensitivity and agency, uh, are actually not, right? That the patterns of behavior can be broken down, that we don't only have to act on instinctual levels, that we don't only have to be able to act on these very difficult impulses around contraction, around unpleasant experience of greed or of anger, you know, the delusion that arises with our inability to just process everything that's happening. You know, this is very much this mechanism that we're trying to observe so that we aren't beholden to uh, biological patterns or social patterns that we've inherited, or our own patterning that we may have developed in our own lives, in our own times. How exquisite, how unique, how rare to have a space, to have a method, to have a practice that is able to like take that seriously, take the responsibility of it seriously. Never mind this next question of then how is subjectivity and agency translated into coordination between organisms, right? That's so much of what our society is like these weird ways that we coordinate um, these impulses, powerful ways, beautiful ways, dangerous ways. Where, what is there a boundary between what we call the internal experience and the external experience? Can something truly only be looking internally? Is there not always some sensitivity to the world? Is there not always some impact that results from the agency of that response? When I was in South America this fall, of course, at times arose this kind of question of would I like teach at all, or would I look for opportunities to teach Dhamma? And I really didn't, I really made the choice to just not assert that kind of agency, but to mostly be receptive to, what I experienced, sort of in different ways. And one of the things that, was so powerful, as I've mentioned a little bit before, and intense, was this understanding of the role that the Catholic Church has played in Latin America, South America. And of course, primarily the most visceral, the most impactful, partly because of my own orientation, were the atrocities, was the horrors of it. Not to deny the good that many religious people have done and through or outside of their institutions, over the centuries. But that sense of just utter horror and tragedy, right? That religious organization, institution, structure was a participant in and responsible to a large degree, for in a society. And so this question of like, do I want that? Do I want to participate in a religious organization that is structuring itself for greater social power? No. The was pretty clearly like my internal response. One of the kind of complex, one of the levels of complexity right now that I think is often overlooked around like um, the colonial heritage of all of the Americas, we'll just say, is like this kind of framing it around right? Like white people came, they killed millions of indigenous people, they enforced their economic model, and they destroyed the social and spiritual um, foundations of the people who were in those vast territories. And so it's like that clearly is what happened. But what's important to also see is like, and harder to fathom is that isn't how it was structured on purpose. That like when you look at Quito, for example, you had the Franciscans and the Jesuits and the Capuchins, and you had all these people who thought they were in conflict with one another, right? It's like it turned out into that. It ended up in what we know as like colonization. But the process by which it got there was full of people who thought they were working against each other. There was not an awareness of the coherence that was like subliminal, that was unconscious, that led to this very coherent perspective that we can look back on, right? Of like how that happened and what happened. And is that it's so important to see that that coherence is not necessarily experienced in the moment. It's like the same in the Northeast in New England, right? It's like when the English first came, it wasn't the same dynamic. It's like, oh, white people and native people. It was like there are so many different tribes, and there was so much complexity in terms of their interactions with each other and dominance. And then there were different tribes of Europeans, right, that came from the Dutch and the English and the French. And all of the alliances and formations that resulted from that were were not like there was so much complexity to what people thought their motivation was in those moments from native people and Europeans. It wasn't until like King Philip's War where this like boom, it coalesced. It's like these people are rebelling. These are the Indians. We are the white people. And that like and that like the version of colonization that we understand now and we interpret looking back happened. And so it's like, how do we take that into serious consideration, right? That like the coherence of the ideology wasn't there, right? That people thought they were arguing with one another or working against one another, but really there was this collaborative impulse that was unconscious that still led to this. And that I have a phenomenal degree of terror of that possibility, of skepticism about the our always our ability to see what forces we're really acting on and motivating when it comes to all kinds of things. Certainly when it comes to institutions. When I first started meditating and getting into this world, I remember this like it was an organization in Massachusetts where, I was involved in a research project with people who were doing social justice work that was rooted in some kind of contemplative practice. And there were other people in our organization who were working with lawyers and judges and trying to see like what's the relationship between spiritual practice, contemplative practice of many kinds, and then the law. Others with higher education. So this idea that like people are integrating their spiritual practice into their lives, into their work, into their world in like beautiful ways. And how important that is and how beautiful that is and meaningful it is. And that there was something about being an agent of coalescing that, of encouraging that. And I remember very clearly we had this fantasy that like someday, maybe meditation will be like on the cover of Time magazine, and like that will be our experience of like it has achieved mainstreamness, and that's like this success. And of course, that has happened. And not just Time magazine, it's like you can't go to the drugstore or wherever, right, and see mindfulness, how good it is for you, uh, on whatever magazine. And what I think, like, didn't consider at that point was like, well, in order to become mainstream, in order to become that there has to be an unconscious coherence, similar to these other things around whiteness, around capitalism, around a superiority of sense of superiority of spiritual perspective. That's what allows it to have social power in the context that we're in, largely. And so this sense of like, what is the responsibility that we also have to not participate in that, to be so careful about what we are unconsciously creating through assumptions of our views, of our um, perspectives, mm, that carry this unconscious coherence towards something really problematic. Of course, right? Buddhism would never do that. But it's like, no, you look at Burma, you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Japan, right? In World War II. It's like Buddhism, as much as anything, is primed to be a vehicle for liberation or human suffering. And it's not always clear what forces are at play that lead towards that. What is our role in the place of the ending of human suffering? Any of us, you know? What is our responsibility? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our hopes, our aspirations? These things are not always so clear. The dangers are not always so evident. The possibilities are not always so evident. I think I am very skeptical in the belief that there is one way, right? That everyone has this responsibility to do this or that, right? I have many heroes and sheroes in my life who have been dedicated pioneer, people who are just out there trying to change the world. I have people in my life who are equally inspiring, who either I know or know of, right? Same on the other side, who spent their lives in caves trying to do this practice, trying to work at that level of like the single-celled organism, trying to understand like this input, that output, this input, that output, and like the incredible magnitude of the task of purifying that process is impossible to overstate, as is the task of trying to purify the process around us, right? I don't think one is actually less simple. And there isn't I don't believe that there is a command, a mandate to say it has to be this way, that each of you should do this, or that we should do this, or it's like it's a very important exploration, but the answer isn't, if the answer is clear, you should be very suspicious. You know, I have this poster at my desk. Let's see if I can you can see it. It says, primero dejar de ser que dejar de ser revolucionario. And you'll see books I'll probably never read, my ads for my stonework, my woodwork. Primero dejar de ser que dejar de ser revolucionario. It's an old Cuban poster. Basically, sort of, it's better to stop being than to stop being a revolutionary. I know what that meant in the context it was created in. I know the parts of that I find inspiring, the parts of it that I find really troubling. What does it mean in terms of a path of internal revolution that is dependent on the ending of being of a certain kind, right? Of bhava, right? The ending of being is the revolution on a certain level, right? In our practice. There's a great quote from Dr. King that there is recent, I know it's late. Dr. King's take on Malcolm X is not as clear and as condemning as much of history has pointed to. The transcript from his interview with Alex Haley has now been found, and you can see that what got printed in an interview is actually not at all what he said about Malcolm X. And I'm not actually going to read that. You should look it up because it's very beautiful, really moving. But Haley also asks King at some point, critics about King's like, what does he say about critics labeling him as an extremist? At first, it disturbed me. Then I began to consider that, yes, I would like to think myself an extremist. In the light of the Christ-like spirit, which made Jesus an extremist for love. At first, it disturbed me. Then I began to consider that, yes, I would like to think of myself as an extremist. In the light of the Christ-like spirit, which made Jesus an extremist for love. You know, it's like no one is going to, we're pretty open about like what we think about things and our views on the world. And at the same time, it always feels so important, like fundamentally important, that you, none of you should feel the need to share our views in order to practice this practice with integrity. That the idea of a space to practice meditation, to do this work, be dependent on views is like contrary to what the Buddha taught. We might share some views. We're definitely not going to share many. There are many things we will not share views on. And it's like that cannot be the foundation of the structure and the safety that is required to do this exploration, right? To look at the subtlety of what's happening in the heart and mind with such care and with such delicacy and such interest and such fascination, right? Everyone who joins us has to feel safe that whatever, if you are practicing as a single-celled organism that is like right, that we have tools for that. That's the Theravadan Buddhism, like boom, sense experience after sense experience. It's like one pointed. There is no three dimensions. There is just mind moment after mind moment. And like we love that. And if you're out there with like your tentacle trying to like change something and being newly sensitive to something, like we'll want to work with that. And if you have a billion tentacles trying to do a billion things. Like we're into that, right? That there is no sense that you have to have any shared view with us, with each other, in order to honestly and legitimately feel welcome in this practice and to feel like you're doing it right. We are all changing, we're all imperfect. And there might be times where, of course, we may have differences, and yet that's partly the hilarity of AJ Musty's notion of a union, right? It has to be an army and it has to be a town hall. And we're neither of those. You know, I mean, it's like we protect this space to try to practice, to sit, to explore these things, to feel safe enough to do that, to feel safe enough to ask about it and to support you in that. We see the limitations of that at times, right? There's not a lot of, we call it a sangha, and it's elements of sangha that we have that are really beautiful. But of course, many people will know it's like there's no coffee hour, there's no book club, there's no white advocacy group, there's no, it's like whatever. There's like these beautiful things that many sanghas have that are important and wonderful, and like it's not to disparage them at all, but to get like what the peculiarities and particularities of our capacity are, and the very much conceived notions of what it is that we're offering and why, and the very considered notions of that are very important. Not something we want to undermine or threaten carelessly. So we encourage the carefulness, we encourage the exploration, we encourage wherever any of us may be around any of the sense of our own suffering and the suffering of the world, the dynamics of that in the world, the dynamics of that in our hearts, minds, and bodies. Um, and we're so committed to continuing to provide in the way that we understand, in the way that we have confidence in the way that we um, can do, creating a space, a protected and encouraging space for that exploration for all of us. Mm. And are enthusiastic about the many other forms of Buddhist organization and individual exploration that exists in this world and that will come to exist. Mm. Okay, everyone, take good care of yourselves and each other. Mm. We'll see you next week, hopefully.